When it comes to fighting game franchises that would get left by the wayside, Art of Fighting exists as one of the most intriguing series that got abandoned in the 90s. As for these fighters, it's not just their cool aesthetics that make them worth remembering, they deserve celebrating for the impact they had on other SNK fighting games, and perhaps even more importantly, the fact that their legacy is so directly tied to the Street Fighter franchise that the two series are essentially blood relatives. So with all of that said, join me today as we take a trip back through time and explore the history of these legendary games. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is Art of Fighting, the rise and fall of Street Fighters. Weird brother. Yeah. Art of Fighting, what an important series, from its groundbreaking debut in the early 90s boasting innovative gameplay and unforgettable characters to its eventual decline amid fierce competition and evolving gaming trends. I'd be hard pressed to refer to these video games as martial arts masterpieces, but they're certainly beloved classics that deserve a spotlight. Digging straight into the Art of Fighting story, we first need to turn our attention to another SNK franchise, Fatal Fury. First released back in 1991, this video game was directed by Takeshi Nishiyama, the very same gentleman who directed the original Street Fighter game released way back in 1987. We have already discussed at length on this channel about how Fatal Fury was seen as the spiritual Street Fighter 2 by its creator, along with the interesting fact that the concept for Terry Bogard was originally drafted up during the development of Street Fighter. This makes his recent emergence in Street Fighter 6 all the more poetic, as Street Fighter and Fatal Fury were born from the same father. However, they also have another fighting game sibling. The links between the history of the Street Fighter franchise and SNK games do not end here, and there are further examples of important fighting games released by SNK that were created by key staff members who worked on the first Street Fighter game. Speaking of the pioneering 1987 game, you can experience it alongside 15 other Street Fighter arcade games in the amazing Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. That's not all though, as if you are like myself and love sprite-based fighters, I highly recommend the Capcom Fighting Collection, a single purchase containing the Darkstalkers games, Cyberbots and more, and even Red Earth, a hidden gem of a Capcom arcade fighter that was previously lost to the arcades of the 90s. I can get you up to 75% off both of these huge collections simply by using my affiliate link via the pinned comments. Or if more modern fighters are for you, don't worry, thousands of deals can be accessed, such as 75% off of Street Fighter 6 and even a massive discount on a Year 2 Ultimate Pass, giving you M. Bison and soon those sweet SNK characters too. Happy shopping! As for the Art of Fighting series, the games we are covering today, they could also be seen as Street Fighter's relatives. This is for multiple reasons, as aside from characters from Art of Fighting going on to appear alongside Street Fighters in Capcom vs SNK games, there are a number of other important factors that play into this too. The original game was directed under the leadership of Hiroshi Matsumoto, a man who had previously worked alongside Nishiyama as the key planner and designer of the original Street Fighter game, who can even be credited for inventing the famous Hadouken attack. After the massive success of the first Street Fighter game, both men were headhunted and recruited by Capcom's arcade competition, changing the trajectory of fighting game history forever. After leaving Capcom for SNK, like Nishiyama, Matsumoto would also go on to work on Fatal Fury, Nishiyama's spiritual sequel to his well-known game. But of course, it's what would be created next, which is most poignant today. Intriguingly, Art of Fighting, released by SNK in 1992, just 1 year after Fatal Fury's release, would be set in the same fictional universe as Fatal Fury, with the game essentially functioning as its story prequel. But aside from it being positioned in a particularly interesting way, is of course the gameplay that made the game truly stand out. At first glance, the game shares many similarities with the legendary Street Fighter 2, released the previous year by Capcom, in that matches take place between a selection of fighters in 2 out of 3 full encounters, with characters using various fighting styles and special techniques in order to win. Like Fatal Fury before it, the game was developed to run on Neo Geo MVS arcade hardware, with the player being given 2 basic attacks consisting of both punches and kicks. A third button would be implemented and used to switch between punches, kicks and throws, and the fourth button would be used for executing taunts. While all of this sounds like essential stuff to include in a fighting game now, back then, arguably, things were less obvious, as Street Fighter 2, which had changed everything, was less than a year old, and Art of Fighting would do some innovating of its own. Amongst this uniqueness, Art of Fighting utilises a feature known as the Spirit Gauge, which is located directly under the character's life bars. Characters within the game can perform special attacks, but as these moves are performed, their spirit gauge depletes, and when the gauge gets low, these moves become weaker. Building on this mechanic, players have the opportunity within matches to lower their opponent's spirit gauges. This is achieved by executing taunts, which we briefly mentioned earlier. But Art of Fighting would introduce more new features to the fighting game medium than simply this. Adding further to its legacy, Art of Fighting would be the first fighting game ever to allow players to perform special super attacks, which in this game's case are referred to as super death blows. Unlike many supers of today, super death blows cannot simply be performed, and instead must be earned by players successfully completing bonus rounds. 1992 was a different time. What made this game stand out didn't stop there though, as probably the most striking feature of the combat relates to the game's presentation, which of course brings us to the impressive graphical scaling, a feature that this very game would introduce to the fighting game genre. This was a cool addition to the game which really helped separate the style of this title from its contemporaries during its year of release. Essentially, as characters move towards each other, the camera zooms in to maximise the level of detail on screen, helping Art of Fighting grab attention and separate it somewhat from the pack of many fighting games that were being released. Speaking of the game's graphical and art style, it is also notable that Matsumoto opted to include another impressive feature to the game's design. What I'm referring to in this instance relates to character sprite animations. Creatively, as fights progress, characters in the game appear more visually cut, bruised and damaged as fights escalate, an artistic choice that is emphasised even further when paired with the game's fantastic scaling effect. As you can tell from all of this, a lot of thought was put into the combat and graphics. However, the game's story also helped solidify this one's place in history. As mentioned earlier, Art of Fighting is set prior to the events of Fatal Fury, thus meaning the story takes place all the way back in 1978. While Street Fighter 2 had recently established the trope of fighting games with huge playable rosters, Art of Fighting is really the first fighting game that I can think of at least to feature a sort of story mode, if you will. In this game, in a single player campaign, you can take control of one of two fighters, either Ryo Sakazaki or Robert Garcia. The plot of this game features both of these young men on a quest to save Ryo's sister, Yuri, who has been kidnapped by a man known as Mr. Big, which I guess makes this game canon with the events of Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Anyway, on the subject of this riveting story, Mr. Big took the girl captive to get the attention of a man known as Takuma Sakazaki. Takuma is Ryo's father, and the originator of a fictional form of karate that translates as the extreme style. In terms of a style, we'll get back to that very shortly, but first let's look a bit deeper at the game's two main protagonists. Regarding the game's dynamic duo, as mentioned, only Ryo and Robert are playable in the single-player story mode. However, all of the characters are controllable in some way or another between the two players in versus mode. Ryo, the game's starter character, looks extremely similar to the likes of Ryu and Ken, and during an interview with Takeshi Nishiyama, he even stated that Ryo was created as a homage to Ryu from Street Fighter. A decision that is hard to argue with is an ethical dilemma, considering Nishiyama and Matsumoto were the gentlemen behind Ryu and Street Fighter in the first place. So really, this makes Ryo to Ryu what Ukulele would become to Banjo-Kazooie, or perhaps Mighty No. 9 to Mega Man, but the less said about that mess, the better. In contrast to Ryo, the game's co-star, Robert Garcia, is visually modelled differently from any character from any fighting game previously, and instead was modelled on a combination of Andy Garcia and Steven Seagal. You know, the Steven Seagal who was an action movie star in the days before he was an embarrassing, meme-worthy individual who eats carrots. Oh no! Story-wise, it is said that Robert naturally excelled at martial arts, whereas Ryo, on the other hand, struggled, and could only keep up with Robert due to strict training from his father. However, as interesting an individual as Robert was, it was perhaps Capcom's response to him and Ryo's existence that was most legendary in this whole situation. In the amusing twist, at a later date, when Capcom released the Street Fighter Alpha series, they would come up with a character known as Dan Hibiki, a bumbling idiot said to parody both Ryo and Robert Garcia simultaneously. Dan is the master of the so-called strongest fighting style, a technique that clearly pokes fun at Art of Fighting's extreme fighting style. Dan would go on to become a huge fan favourite in his own right, with players loving the character's humorous design, signature moves and mannerisms. Not bad at all for a joke at the expense of a competition. In a single player playthrough, Ryo and Robert encounter a range of opponents to test their skills. The first of these challenges is against an individual known as Ryohaku Todo. This man fights using the Todo fighting style, a technique he created and teaches. He has a long-standing rivalry with Ryo's father and those who use the extreme style. Art of Fighting, just like Fatal Fury, places a heavier emphasis on story, a direction that Nishiyama and Matsumoto were keen to bring fighting games in, much like the martial arts movies they appreciated. Moving on, players next progress to a bar where they must face off with Jack Turner, a large rotund man who functions as one of Mr. Big's highest ranking subordinates. Linked to Fatal Fury and the expanded universe its creators seem to be building, he is also the leader of a gang that operates in the crime-ridden Southtown. Adding to the list of fighters that must be overcome, the game's next opponent is Li Pai Long, a master of Chinese martial arts from Taiwan. Despite being from a privileged background, the man has neglected his roots though to become a street fighter. Building on the lore, he is another former adversary of Ryo's father who must be defeated. Now, King is an interesting and novel fighter, in that when players defeat this sharply dressed French Muay Thai fighter, his shirt pops open to reveal that she has a pair of breasts. King, who dresses as a man in order to present herself as a reliable fighter, hides her true identity for various reasons, such as the fact that she has been at war with her identity for years. Considering that this game came out years before appealing to so-called modern audiences, it is likely that this character was partly inspired by Joan of Arc, what with her being French and all. As the game continues, the next match takes place against a muscled boxing opponent known as Mickey Rogers. His backstory is that he was a professional boxer who was expelled from the sport due to accidentally killing a man in the ring. In the game, he still roams Southtown looking for opponents to take out his frustrations on. If he dies, he dies. Continuing to run a gauntlet, the next match takes place against John Crawley, whose character and stage design are both very clear rip-offs of Guile, another one of the more popular characters from Street Fighter 2. He is a martial arts instructor, and with his brutal and aggressive fighting style, he was known to his friends as the Madman and the Killing Machine, thus perhaps suggesting that he should have been included in another game that has been dubiously claimed to be the true Street Fighter 2, the hilariously bad Human Killing Machine. Once players have made it through this gang of opponents, skilled combatants finally reach Mr. Big. Formerly an Army Special Forces officer, he fights skillfully with a pair of eskrima sticks. Mr. Big has been involved with the mob for as long as he can remember, so functions perfectly as a major antagonist in this one. As mentioned earlier in the video, Big secretly fears Takuma Sakazaki, the master of the extreme fighting style, which apparently is the reason as to why he kidnapped his daughter. Not the best idea in my opinion if that is the case. Upon defeating Mr. Big, he reveals the location of Ryo's sister, but also states that she is being guarded by a stronger fighter. Once Ryo arrives at the location on his motorcycle, he is confronted with the game's true final boss, the formidable Mr. Karate. After defeating this tough opponent, who suspiciously utilises the extreme fighting style, the game ends on a cliffhanger just before the player unmasks this mysterious opponent, leaving players to wait for the game's sequel to reveal who the fighter is and what his motivations were. But as far as storytelling goes, this narrative cliffhanger is even further proof of what makes Art of Fighting so unique from the titles that came before it, within the fighting game genre. Aside from the mechanics in this game, which we covered earlier, fights are interlaced with these bonus stages, which occur between every two opponents. These bonus rounds include a bottle cutting stage, where the objective is to cut the top of 5 bottles using careful timing, an ice pillar smashing stage that revolves around breaking ice blocks, and a stage that revolves revolves around players performing super moves a specific number of times to be allowed to perform super death blows in combat. Successfully completing these bonus stages increases the player's life and spirit bars, so there are rewards all around here. This made an entry in the Art of Fighting series would go on to be released on SNK's own Neo Geo AES home platform, as well as ports to the Super Nintendo, Sega Mega Drive and PC Engine CD, which would all greatly differ in terms of gameplay, features and quality. The Mega Drive version of the game that saw release in 1994 removed the game's zoom-in effect entirely, and characters and background sprites were made smaller, and many of the game's speech samples were removed. While these removals are of course disappointing, to the Mega Drive version's credit, controls could be spread to utilise the system's 6-button control pads. Furthermore, in this version, Mr. Big and Mr. Karate are playable in 2-player versus mode from the outset, whereas a special code needs to be input to make them available in the arcade version. The Western and Japanese versions of the game differ too, with the AI in the Western version being significantly more difficult to compete against. One could put this down to the same scenario that likely took place with the Western release of Streets of Rage 3, with both games being made more difficult so that players would struggle to beat the game in one sitting when renting the title from Blockbuster Video, a huge nemesis of the Japanese video game industry at the time. Due to everything just mentioned, the Mega Drive version of the game is not as strong as its Neo Geo counterpart, but I guess at least it was available in the home at a much cheaper price point. As expected, like the Mega Drive version of the game, the Super Nintendo version is also gimped. The sprites in this entry still look polished, but the animation is inferior, characters move stiffly, and the collision detection is a little bit off. The game utilises some scaling effects, but nowhere near to the degree of its arcade counterpart. The only major positive this version really brings is that it has an additional ending scene that reveals the ending to the game's cliffhanger, but I will discuss the result of that part of the game when discussing the rise of Art of Fighting 2 shortly. On the subject of different ports of the title, the PC Engine CD version of the game was fairly ambitious, so much so in fact that a special arcade card was needed to be able to get the game to run on the basic 8-bit hardware. The game was pretty much in line with the other console ports of the game, which is not a bad effort considering all things. If you thought Street Fighter 2 was an impressive feat for the PC Engine, then Art of Fighting pushes the hardware one step further. When it is all said and done, I must really commend Matsumoto for the creation of Art of Fighting. Fatal Fury's brother and Street Fighter's half-brother pushed the genre forward in a variety of different ways and therefore made a game like no other that had really come before it. The game's zoom-in effects are impressive and new, the sprite's ability to display cuts and bruises added to the game's aesthetics, and the introduction of super moves and spirit gauges that depleted as characters executed special moves added a whole range of new layers to the fighting game genre. But amongst all of this, the game's story must also be credited for adding an extra layer of appeal to a style of game that is not, on the whole, particularly storyline driven. It is without a doubt that at the time of this game's release, Art of Fighting delivered the most appealing story in fighting game history, which was even punctuated with a cliffhanger to bring players back for the next entry in the series. Speaking of the next entry in the series, we shall of course be discussing Art of Fighting 2 very soon, but first we need to visit another chapter in this franchise's rich existence. 1993 would see the release of Fatal Fury Special, a souped up version of Fatal Fury 2. Ryo Sakazaki's inclusion in Fatal Fury Special was a surprising and significant moment in the history of fighting games. Despite their links, Fatal Fury and Art of Fighting were two separate franchises with distinct storylines and characters. Having Ryo appear in Fatal Fury Special marked one of the earliest instances of a crossover character from another game series, especially within the same company, SNK. This was a big deal because crossovers were rare and it was unusual for characters to cross the boundary between distinct game series. Ryo's appearance hinted at the possibility of a shared universe within SNK's fighting games, which later became a defining feature of the company's titles, especially with the introduction of the King of Fighters series. This interconnected universe allowed for a richer lore and more complex storytelling, blending characters and plot lines from different games. While his appearance was considered non-canon, this opened up a new realm of possibilities for character interactions and narrative development, making SNK's games more immersive and engaging for fans. Ryo was a beloved character with a strong following, and his appearance in Fatal Fury Special provided a unique opportunity for fans to see him in a different context and game style. This crossover created a buzz in the arcade scene, and among console players significantly boosting the game's popularity and appeal. It was a moment of fan service that resonated with many players, years before crossovers had become almost expected. This move was not only significant within SNK's lineup, but also across the entire fighting game genre, influencing how developers approached character integration and universe building in their games. But enough about this cool cameo, let's move on to talking about this. Art of Fighting 2 was released in February of 1994. Just like its predecessor from 2 years earlier, this fighting game was developed and published by SNK for the Neo Geo arcade and home platforms, with Matsumoto in charge of producing it. Expectedly, the primary reason for releasing Art of Fighting 2 was to build on the success of its predecessor, Art of Fighting, which was part of SNK's effort to compete in the highly popular fighting game genre. By the early 1990s, fighting games were extremely popular in arcades, with titles like Street Fighter II and its many iterations continuing to lead the market. Art of Fighting 2 aimed to improve upon the gameplay mechanics, graphics and story elements of the original to attract a larger audience and solidify SNK's position in the competitive fighting game market. The sequel introduced new characters, refined combat systems, and continued the storyline from the first game, adding depth and continuity to the series. But was it a major step up from what came before it? Let's discuss. As already covered, the first game ends with a cliffhanger where Mr. Karate's true identity is not explicitly confirmed in the storyline, leaving players wondering about the details and the implications of this reveal. In Art of Fighting 2, the story continues and provides more context and resolution to this cliffhanger. The game clarifies that Mr. Karate is indeed Takuma Sakazaki, Ryo's father. The storyline explores how Takuma was coerced into working for the crime boss Mr. Big, who threatened the lives of his children. This revelation explains why Takuma had been absent and why he adopted the Mr. Karate persona, which he used to protect his identity and his family while working under duress. But beyond all of this, what I like most about this plot is how it links even further to the Fatal Fury series than even its predecessor. The story of Art of Fighting 2 takes place a year after the original game, in the vibrant and dangerous year of 1979. Making his debut in the Art of Fighting plot, we have a new primary secret antagonist, Geese Howard, a rising power in Southtown's criminal underworld. That's right, it appears that the main villain of Fatal Fury series was terrorizing Southtown as early as the 70s. In Art of Fighting 2, Geese orchestrates an epic martial arts tournament, the King of Fighters. He calls upon 12 formidable fighters, both seasoned veterans and fresh contenders, to compete in the city. This storyline ties the two franchises further together, with a dark history as 2 years after the events of Art of Fighting 2, he brutally murders Jeff Bogart, his former sparring partner. This tragic event ignites a burning desire for vengeance in Jeff's adoptive sons, Terry and Andy Bogart. This vow to confront Geese in his next King of Fighters tournament sets the stage for an epic showdown a decade later in 1991. The intertwined fates of these fighters create a gripping saga of betrayal, revenge and martial arts mastery, so it's cool to see things beginning to play out years before Terry Bogard burst canonically onto the scene. The development of Art of Fighting 2 spanned an intense year. For the new characters, SNK enjoyed creative freedom, as they weren't bound to the existing story. This liberty allowed the team to craft bold and unique designs like the striking Kisaragi and the formidable Temjin, aiming to rival the standout aesthetics of the King of Fighters, the newly released Ultimate SNK crossover fighting game. Balancing these new fighters proved to be the most challenging aspect of development. While the first game prioritised an engaging story and emphasised CPU battles, Art of Fighting 2 shifted its focus towards a King of Fighters style tournament experience. The team aimed to enhance the importance of versus play, creating a more dynamic and competitive gameplay experience, and Geese Howard, a fan favourite from Fatal Fury, was included as a hidden boss. His appearance in the game was influenced by his popularity, and the younger look showcased in the original video animation added an exciting twist for players. Art of Fighting 2, the thrilling second installment in the series, introduced the innovative Rage Gauge. Building on the Spirit system from the first game, the Rage Gauge controls the use and potency of special attacks, adding a strategic layer to the combat. This time, the bonus stages are revamped. To boost the Rage Gauge, players must shatter a tree with a single punch. To increase the maximum health meter, they must defeat a gang of punks within a time limit. The classic Initiate Super Death Blow stage has been tailored for each character's unique super special moves. making the experience even more personalised and intense. Almost every character from the original Art of Fighting returns, with the exception of Ryohaku Todo. The game also introduces 3 exciting new fighters, Yuri Sakazaki, Eiji Kisaragi and Temjin, bringing the total roster to 12 characters. Unlike the first game, where only Ryo Sakazaki and Robert Garcia were playable in single player mode, Art of Fighting 2 lets players choose from all 12 characters, vastly expanding the gameplay variety. Although not playable in the arcade version, Geese can be unlocked in the Versus mode on the Super Nintendo version, offering fans a chance to experience his power firsthand. Art of Fighting 2 garnered high praise from both GamePro and Electronic Gaming Monthly for its significant improvements over the original. The game boasted enhanced graphics, superior sound quality, a broader character selection and more refined gameplay mechanics. However, 3 of VGM's 4 reviewers noted that the single player mode's AI could be frustratingly difficult. Computer and video games lauded it as easily the best beat 'em up to appear in recent years, favourably comparing it to the recent iterations of Street Fighter 2. But as cool as Art of Fighting 2 was, it wasn't the most popular SNK fighting game to feature Robert and Ryo that debuted that year. The characters from Art of Fighting were introduced into the King of Fighters series in its very first installment, The King of Fighters 94. Firstly, the concept of crossover appeal was groundbreaking. The King of Fighters 94 was one of the first games to bring together characters from different SNK franchises, including Art of Fighting, Fatal Fury and Akari Warriors, into a single title. This crossover solidified the shared universe, allowing players to experience a game that combined their favourite characters from separate series. It was an innovative idea at the time and significantly boosted the game's appeal. This interconnectedness provided a rich narrative experience for players. Additionally, the inclusion of Art of Fighting characters provided a sense of legacy and nostalgia for fans of SNK's older games. Seeing familiar faces return in a new context allowed players to explore what-if scenarios in battles between characters from different series, which was a unique and exciting prospect. Iconic rivalries like the anticipated showdown between Robert Garcia and Terry Bogard from Fatal Fury became possible, offering fans dream matches they had long imagined. Overall, the introduction of Art of Fighting characters into the King of Fighters was a significant milestone in the history of fighting games. It contributed to a larger and more varied roster, offering players more options, enhancing the game's replayability. But enough about that. Let's move on to talking about the third game in the Art of Fighting trilogy. Art of Fighting 3, The Path of the Warrior was released on March 12, 1996. The game was developed and published by SNK for the Neo Geo arcade and home console systems. The release of Art of Fighting 3 was part of SNK's strategy to continue and expand its popular fighting game franchises. The Art of Fighting series by this point was notable for its focus on storytelling and character development within the fighting game genre, and a third installment aimed to enhance these elements while also introducing new gameplay mechanics and characters. Art of Fighting 3 was particularly notable for its improved graphics and animation, using motion capture technology to create more realistic and fluid character movements. This release was an effort to keep the series competitive in the rapidly evolving fighting game market of the mid-90s, which was in the realms of sprite-based action, being dominated by franchises such as Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. The game's cast reintroduces a fresh lineup of characters, with only a few familiar faces returning. Robert Garcia and Ryo Sakazaki are the sole playable veterans from previous installments, bringing their signature style to the mix. Additionally, Yuri Sakazaki makes a special appearance, though not as a playable character, and a touch of familiarity for long-term fans of the series. Recently, Street Fighter 6 has received heaps of praise for switching up its story to revolve around Ken Masters rather than Ryu, but many years before, Art of Fighting 3 switched its story to revolve around Robert Garcia rather than Ryo like previously. In Art of Fighting 3, Robert embarks on a mission to find the missing girl named Freya Lawrence. Freya, an old friend and love interest of Robert, has disappeared in the small town of Glass Hill Valley, Mexico. Robert learns that Freya has become involved with Wyler, a wealthy and eccentric scientist obsessed with recreating an ancient elixir that supposedly unlocks hidden human potential. Wyler plans to use Freya's knowledge to achieve his goals. As Robert searches for Freya, he encounters various fighters, each with their own motivations and connections to the central story. This includes Carmen Cole, a loyal servant of Wyler, and new characters like Kazumi Todor, who seeks to restore her family's honour, as well as Detective Robert Burtz and Lenny Creston. Their intertwining stories reveal a deeper conspiracy involving Wyler's experiments and the town's inhabitants. The climax occurs when Robert confronts Wyler, who has managed to recreate the elixir. However, instead of gaining superhuman abilities, Wyler transforms into a monstrous form, losing control over his powers. In terms of the combat itself, the intensity of battles reaches new heights with the dynamic spirit system. As in previous installments, the spirit gauge decreases with special techniques that can be strategically replenished by keeping your distance from the opponent. Cleverly, you can provoke your foes to draw them into your territory, significantly draining their spirit and leaving them vulnerable. This blend of strategy and fighting adds a new dimension to head-to-head combat. Beyond standard punches, kicks and throws, each character once again wields devastating death blows. These powerful techniques, as usual, use up a portion of the player's spirit gauge. If the spirit level falls below green, these moves lose their potency and range. However, players can recharge their spirit by standing still, though this leaves them dangerously exposed to attacks. Art of Fighting 3 amps up the excitement with unique special moves and super death blows for each character. These spectacular attacks are only accessible when your remaining strength and rage gauge align, but the payoff is immense, delivering crushing blows to your unsuspecting opponents. A game-changing new feature is the Ultimate KO, where a fight can end instantly. If your opponent's strength drops below 10%, delivering a super death blow to finish them off and win the entire match, regardless of previous rounds or victories, is possible. This rule adds a now biasing tension to every encounter, making battles more violent and exhilarating than ever before. As for the new fighters in this one, we have Carmen Cole, the suave bodyguard of Robert's father. He is a gentlemanly fighter with a business-like demeanour. His fighting style incorporates elements of Aikido and pro wrestling, making him a versatile and unpredictable opponent. His stoic personality contrasts with his flashy moves, and his story is intertwined with Garcia's, adding a layer of mystery and sophistication to his character. Kasumi Todor is a determined and skilled martial artist, seeking revenge for her father's defeat at the hands of Ryo Sakazaki. Her graceful yet powerful fighting style, based on Todor Ryu Akajitsu, emphasizes counters and fluid movements. Kazumi's presence in the game adds a personal vendetta subplot, giving her motivations a more emotional and relatable edge. Lenny Creston is a dynamic and energetic bounty hunter with a penchant for quick, acrobatic moves. Her fighting style mixes various martial arts with street fighting techniques, reflecting her gritty and adaptable nature. Lenny's playful personality and sharp wit make her a charismatic addition, bringing a refreshing energy to the roster. Roddy Burtz, the mysterious and stoic martial artist, has a deep connection to the game's lore. Working as a bodyguard and a professional wrestler, his moves are a mix of traditional martial arts and showy wrestling techniques. Roddy's quiet demeanour and intense presence hint at a complex backstory, making players curious about his true intentions. Sinclair is an energetic swordswoman, possibly the most mysterious character in the game. Her elegant and precise fighting style, which incorporates fencing and martial arts, sets her apart from the rest. Sinclair's motivations are shrouded in secrecy, and her cold, calculated nature adds an element of danger and intrigue to the game's narrative. Wang Ko-san is an elderly master of Chinese martial arts, and is a sage-like figure with a playful side. Despite his age, Wang's agility and mastery of Kung Fu make him a formidable opponent. His inclusion adds a traditional martial arts flavour to the roster, and his wisdom and quirky personality provides a charming contrast to the younger fighters. These new characters bring diverse fighting styles and rich backstories, making Art of Fighting 3 not just a fighting game, but a narrative experience. Each character's motivations and connections to the storyline add layers of depth, making every fight more than just a battle of fists. It's a clash of personalities and destinies. Wyler, the final boss of Art of Fighting 3, the Path of the Warrior, is a tall, muscular man with a rugged appearance. Wyler's obsession with recreating an ancient elixir that grants extraordinary abilities stems from his father's unfinished work, driving him to conduct dangerous experiments. His fighting style is a chaotic blend of powerful physical attacks and unpredictable movements, enhanced by the unstable elixir, making him a formidable adversary. Despite his intimidating demeanour, Wyler is a tragic figure, torn between honouring his father's legacy and the ethical ramifications of his quest for power, adding a layer of depth and complexity to his character as the game's final antagonist. Despite the ideas that Art of Fighting 3 brought to the table being cool, while the game introduced some unique features and innovations, it wasn't as well received as the previous entries. One major reason was the significant gameplay changes. The third installment adopted a new fighting system that emphasised smooth, fluid animations and a more realistic approach to movement and techniques. Although this was technically impressive, it didn't resonate with all fans, particularly those who preferred the more straightforward and exaggerated combat style of the earlier games. Another criticism was the limited roster of characters. Art of Fighting 3 featured only 10 characters, a number considered very small compared to other fighting games of the time. You have to remember we were in 1996 by this point, and games like the popular Tekken trilogy had massive rosters. This limited selection was a drawback, especially when juxtaposed with more popular titles like Street Fighter or The King of Fighters, which boasted extensive rosters offering a broader variety of playstyles and strategies. The reintroduction of new characters and the shift in the game's story and the setting also did not sit well with all fans. Many felt that some of the new characters lacked the appeal of the original cast, and the changes in narrative focus created a disconnect for players who were invested in the established lore of the series. This divergence in character design and story direction may have contributed to the game's lukewarm reception. Moreover, Art of Fighting 3 faced fierce competition from other fighting games during the mid-90s, a golden era for the genre. The more competitive landscape made it difficult for Art of Fighting 3 to carve out a significant niche. Lastly, while the game boasts impressive animations and graphics for its time, these aspects were not enough to compensate for the perceived shortcomings in gameplay and character appeal. The visual style and presentation, though technically proficient, failed to elevate the overall experience in the eyes of many players. 1996 was the era of polygons rather than pixels, and even in the realms of sprite-based gaming, there were bigger and more impressive games than this one. Past this point, SNK decided to stop focusing on the art of fighting, with them choosing to redirect its resources towards more successful and popular titles, such as The King of Fighters. This series offered a more extensive roster and crossover appeal, making it a better fit for the forever evolving competitive landscape. Despite not producing new Art of Fighting games, SNK didn't entirely abandon the series. Instead, they've integrated its characters and storylines into other successful franchises, most notably The King of Fighters. This approach has allowed them to keep the legacy of Art of Fighting alive while focusing on their more popular titles. The continued presence of Art of Fighting characters in other games has ensured that the series remains a part of SNK's rich history. Aside from the occasional re-release digitally or part of compilations, despite its cool contributions to the genre, we haven't had a new Art of Fighting game in 28 years. However, if you watched the recent EVO event, you will be aware that all of that is finally about to change. SNK just announced that they plan to reinvent the franchise as an action RPG. So with that said, comment below what you think about that one, and be sure to let me know if you are keen to see me upload a video giving my thoughts on that situation. I'd be curious to hear your takes. Don't forget you can get up to 90% off of thousands of awesome games, including all major fighting games and collections, using my affiliate link via the pinned comment. Happy shopping! Or if you want to support my videos in a more personal way, please consider backing my show over on Patreon. Yeah! Cheerio!